All right, guys, welcome to Bioethics number 5. We're in a new unit. We're going to start talking about cloning now, so that'll be fun. This week, we're doing cloning 1 and cloning 2, and then next week will be a little bit of a weird schedule. We're going to have an A day and then a B day. On the A day, I believe we're going to try and meet live. I believe that's what's going to happen across Dowling. So next Wednesday, look forward for some more information about a possible live meeting. But for now, for this week, it's the same old, same old. Not normal, but normal-ish. So, cloning, that's what we're talking about today, and that's what we're talking about for the next few weeks. So, when it comes to cloning, we're going to talk about the ethics of cloning, right? But before we can talk about the ethics of cloning, we need to talk about what cloning is. So when you hear the term cloning, what do you think of? Right, I mean, ask yourself this question. I know when I think of the term cloning, I think of Dolly the sheep, all right, the first mammal cloned, right? Dolly the sheep was born in 1996 after 276 attempts to clone a sheep, right? It was, I mean, by statistics, largely unsuccessful venture, but eventually they cloned a sheep, all right? And Dolly, in addition to being the first mammal cloned, like being interesting in a science perspective, is very interesting in an ethics perspective, because it finally brought to the scientific mind that, oh crap, we can clone mammals. All right, so it's real, it's possible, you can clone a mammal. So what are the ethics about cloning mammals, right? Is it ethical to clone a frog but not a sheep? If it's ethical to clone a sheep, can you clone a human? Sort of questions like this, right? Which are questions that need to be discussed. As it turns out, Dolly lived to about half the age of a normal sheep because she had degenerative lung disease and arthritis, and so she was euthanized. But the first mammal to be cloned, Dolly, really sparked the modern bioethics of cloning. Now, cloning, as you probably know, is the act of, instead of, say, like sexual reproduction for sheep, you have a mother sheep and a father sheep and they breed, and you have a baby sheep, which is a mix of the genetics of both. You take just one sheep, like a mother sheep, and you take those genetics and copy and paste them into a new egg, and so you get a new animal which has the exact same genetics as the original animal. And so theoretically, if you did it perfectly, Dolly the sheep would have the exact same DNA test as the sheep she was cloned from, her, mother sheep. And that's how cloning works. So you're making perfect genetic copies of different organisms. All right, so today, before we talk about the ethics, we're going to talk about the science. What is it? How does it work? What do we need to know about it? We'll start getting into the ethics in the next couple days. So, first up, there's a couple types of cloning. In nature, cloning happens. All right, so humans didn't invent cloning. It's been going on for a long time. We usually call it asexual reproduction. Right, so there's plenty of bacteria which reproduce asexually. Yeast, for example, reproduces asexually. So if you're baking bread in your quarantine kitchen, and you take the yeast and you add it to some warm water and add some sugar, the yeast begin to reproduce asexually. So their genetic material of the new yeast produced from the yeast that produced it is exactly the same. Assuming no mutations, which occasionally happen, right? They'd be biologically identical. Their DNA would be the same, basically. And so cloning happens. Organisms make new organisms with the exact same genes that they have. However, this really only happens ordinarily in very, very small organisms like bacteria. We also see essentially what is cloning in identical twins, right? We see, an egg and a sperm come together and begin to develop into a human. And at some point it splits, and then both continue to develop with the same genes. And so we have two organisms, two people, who have the same genes. Now that's all natural cloning, and that's not really being ethically debated because, can you ethically have twins? It's like, well, it just happens. There's nothing you can do about it. But artificial cloning is what we're going to talk about. So, a few types. There's like DNA cloning, right? It's genetic engineering. You take some genes and you use an instrument of science and you copy and paste them into something else. Um, yeah, we do this with corn in Iowa, right? We do some genetic engineering. We clone genes and DNAs of corn that we like to make better corn. This happens all the time. We're going to talk about the ethics of that next unit, but the kind of cloning we think of when we think of cloning is often reproductive cloning. You produce a copy of a whole animal, right? So you've got Dolly the sheep, or Dolly's originator, and you copy it, and you make Dolly 2, right? It's the copy and pasting, the reproduction of a whole animal. We can do this with many animals. You can pay about 50 grand in South Korea to get your dog cloned. Um, it's difficult to do, but it's definitely doable. Finally, there's therapeutic cloning. Right? Therapeutic cloning produces embryonic stem cells, which are aimed at replacing injured or diseased tissue. There's lots of science right now in stem cell research, right? So what sort of diseases can be treated with stem cells? How do you create stem cells? Well, sometimes you can produce them by means of cloning, right? So there's a few different types of cloning. We're mostly going to talk about the ethics of the artificial clonings. But before we do that, let's talk a little more about the science of artificial cloning. All right, so here's a little graph of how it works. All right, so Dolly was a white-faced sheep. All right, now a white-faced sheep looks kind of like most other white-faced sheep, right? So to prove that Dolly was really cloned and not just a good-looking copy of her mother, the scientists who did the cloning on Dolly took a black-faced sheep and took its egg, all right, which when bred with another sheep would produce a black-faced sheep, and they remove the nucleus from the egg, all right, and they take a nucleus from the sheep they want to clone, and they shove it into that egg. Now, the science of that is sort of difficult, and it uses electricity and all sorts of things, but you essentially remove the nucleus from the mother, the black-faced sheep egg, and you add a nucleus from a cell from the white-faced sheep, essentially creating one of the white-faced sheep cells, basically creating that. All right, that embryo is then implanted in the black-faced sheep uterus, and it grows into a lamb, and it is born. And out of a black-faced sheep, you have a white-faced lamb, which is ordinarily not possible. Right, and then you can run a DNA test and find that, oh, this new white-faced lamb has the exact same DNA as the white-faced original sheep. Relatively simple to talk about in broad terms. You remove a nucleus, you add a nucleus, you plant it, and there you go. Of course, it took them over 200 tries to actually get it right, so we can see that it's, in fact, technically difficult. But this was the process for whole animal cloning. This is what they did with Dolly the sheep. And could theoretically be done for all sorts of other animals, right? It can be done for reptiles and amphibians and other mammals and possibly humans, which is the prime ethical question about cloning. All right. You can make cloned animals all sorts of ways, right? So you take the unfertilized egg of what will be the mother, even though it's not genetically related, and you take the nucleus from whatever cell of the animal you want to clone. You can use skin cells, you can use all sorts of cells, but it can't be sex cells because they don't contain the entire genome, right? So you take a skin cell from the animal you want to clone, you remove that nucleus, you take an egg from the mother, you remove that nucleus, you put the skin cell nucleus into the egg, and then you have what is essentially a cell from the original animal that you want to clone. We do this a lot, in fact, in Iowa with livestock. All right, certain pigs in Iowa are cloned. All right, we use this a lot in food animals for increased production of food. We use similar techniques with plants, like with corn and soybeans, to produce increased yield. So this is used a lot in Iowa today. All right, this is not some sort of far out ethical science issue. Like, this is not science fiction. This is not like a theoretical problem or theoretical question. Like, it's happening today within a 50-mile radius of us right now. Right, people are doing it. Monsanto is cloning their corn. Right, it's happening in town. Right, so it's real science that really happens under your nose. We've cloned a lot of animals and more every day, so this list isn't exactly up to date, but we've cloned mice, cows, sheep, and chickens, cats, deers, dogs, horses, mules, etc. even monkeys, which are obviously closer genetically to humans than, say, sheep. And so we can apply this science to a wide variety of animals. Like I said, your dog can be cloned in South Korea for about 50 grand. Note that when you clone an animal, you can do some interesting science on it, right? So you can study animal behaviors with cloning. So, okay, I raise this dog a certain way and then I clone it. How's that new puppy, which is genetically identical to my original dog, how is that puppy going to behave? Right? Will it have the exact same behaviors? Will it have the same temperament? Or is that sort of not so much about the genetics, but about the environment it's raised in, right? So you can do some interesting science on animal behaviors by cloning, and could theoretically do some interesting science on human behaviors by cloning. But the ethics of that we have to talk about before we talk about that. So all sorts of animals have been cloned. So now there's a question: have humans been cloned? And if you Google "have humans been cloned," sometimes you'll see a yes answer. But in fact, there's no evidence that anyone's ever cloned anyone. There's been claims from South Korea in 1998, 2002, and 2004. There's occasionally been claims from Russia and China that humans have been cloned. But no one's ever offered any evidence that they've actually cloned a person. No one's had a picture of a cloned person. No one's showed the DNA test of person to person. So as far as we know, no humans have ever been cloned. There's a biological reason to this. As it turns out, for primates, which were primates included in there, it's slightly more difficult to clone us than certain other animals, even other mammals, because the egg cell spindle proteins can be lost when the nucleus is removed, and these proteins are necessary for cell division. So you remove the nucleus, you put it in the new donor egg, and then it just doesn't divide. It doesn't reproduce because it doesn't have these spindle proteins. So humans are difficult to clone, which is interesting, unlike almost every other mammal. But partially for that reason, we haven't had any humans cloned, and primarily for the ethical reason that in most countries it's illegal to try and clone people, because the lawmakers in the countries believe that it is unethical. And we're going to talk about why they believe that later. So don't believe what you read. If you read that someone has cloned a human, if they have, they need to offer evidence of, here's the genes, here's a picture, that sort of stuff. So, all right. Further, that's whole animal cloning. Let's talk about briefly therapeutic cloning that produces embryonic stem cells. All right, embryonic stem cells are cells for an embryo that can. This is a shorthand way of talking about it. Can essentially become any other cell. Right, so these stem cells can be very useful for replacing other damaged cells or building new areas, and so these embryonic stem cells have lots of potential applications in medicine, right? If they can become whatever cell and your heart has a problem, maybe these embryonic stem cells can help your heart create healthy cells. There's two ways to get these stem cells, all right? One way is embryonic, all right? You take human embryos, which are developing humans, from in vitro fertilization that the parents don't want, and you kill that embryo by removing those stem cells. And you can use those stem cells and even sometimes clone them and use those in research. There are certain ethical issues involved with the killing of a human organism, right, which we're going to talk about. And then the other way to get stem cells, which seems better, is adult stem cells. So you can take bone marrow from an adult who can consent to this. You remove the stem cells from the bone marrow, and then you can clone those and use stem cells for research from adult stem cells from bone marrow. Both are stem cells. Both basically work the same way. One kills a developing human. One is taken from a consenting adult. And it doesn't really harm the adult any more than a bone marrow donation or bone marrow transplant would harm the consenting adult. And so we can clearly see that embryonic stem cell research with adult stem cells presents less ethical concerns than, or rather stem cells from an adult, that research presents less ethical concerns than embryonic stem cells. There's the question of, is genetic, stem cell treatments with humans ethical at all, which we'll talk about. But then, the easier to answer question is, what about embryonic stem cell research? Well, it seems like that's probably less ethical. All right. The way you can extract these stem cells, you go in the bone marrow, you collect all these cells, you sort through them and find the stem cells, you remove all the other cells, you grow them, you divide them, right? And then you can turn them into all sorts of other cells, which you normally cannot create, like neural cells. You can find a link here in the slides for more information about this for you scientifically curious students. All right, here's a little graphic on how embryonic stem cells are created as well. This is from the President's Council on Bioethics, U.S. National Institute of Health. All right, so take a look at these graphics, take a look at those links. Your assignment for today, we can find on OnCampus. All right, so if we go here to Bioethics, you can click on Assignments. For me, it'll be in Future. And so we'll go to here. For you, it should be in Present. And you can see the answer or the discussion, and you can answer it. So answer each prompt with 3 sentences. Is cloning a human being basically the same thing as cloning a sheep? Scientifically. All right, what about ethically, and why did you answer the way you answered? The answer to the scientifically is in what we talked about. The answer ethically I want you to consider and try and make an argument about, and then I want you to defend your answer with the why. Then you respond to 2 of your peers' responses with about 1 sentence each. Remember to be respectful to each other and kind, right? I mean, we can't be with each other in class, but at least we get to talk with each other here, so remember to do your best to be kind to everyone in this discussion. Finally, remember, upcoming next week, Dowling's going to be experimenting with some live classwork, so look out for that in the Announcements tab in OnCampus. All right, that's it for today, Tuesday. I will then see you on Thursday with more cloning.